The truth is, the trauma is ongoing. Indigenous professor Pam Palmater says that Canada is committing modern-day genocide against Indigenous people.
Canada as a state and all of its governments and institutions is guilty of both historic and ongoing genocide. Not only has historic genocide not stopped, it's gotten worse.
Canada became a country in 1867 and was built on top of Indigenous land. First Nations people were forcibly removed from their lands and many were excluded from negotiations.
European colonizers come to this continent. Their so-called Indian policy was to do two things: acquire Indigenous lands and resources, and then reduce any financial obligations. And they only ever had two methods to do that: assimilation or elimination.
By the end of the 19th century, 90 to 99% of Indigenous people in North America had been wiped out.
Some history books say, oh, this was just an accident, European diseases wiped out people. Well, that's part of the truth. But the other part is the murders, the scalping bounties, the forced sterilizations, the deaths of thousands and thousands of children in Indian residential schools.
Indian residential schools were institutions created to assimilate and indoctrinate Indigenous youth into Christian society. Children were separated from their families, stripped of their culture, and faced brutal abuse. Over 1,000 Indigenous women are believed to have been legally sterilized under the 1928 Sexual Sterilization Act, which lasted over 40 years.
Forced sterilizations of Indigenous women and girls continues today. We have several major class action suits against, federal, provincial governments, hospitals, because this is still happening.
Today, there are high rates of poverty, drug addiction, suicide, and homicide amongst First Nations communities.
This trauma, it goes from generation to generation to generation. You cannot meet an Indigenous person or anyone on a First Nation in this country who hasn't experienced state-based violence or have family members who've experienced it.
Today, there are more than 630 First Nations communities in Canada. Reconciliation, land back, and finding missing Indigenous women have become forefront movements for Indigenous rights.
Here's the thing about our people. Whether you come from the Mi'kmaq Nation, the Haida Nation, the Cree Nation, we still have all of the teachings and values of our ancestors. We are still warriors of mind, body, and spirit. It's Indigenous peoples that have won these court cases and stopped mines and stopped pipelines. It's Indigenous peoples.